right, plant lovers. Are you ready to dive deep into the incredible world of plant biodiversity? You've given us some intriguing excerpts from a biology textbook, so let's get to it.
Yeah, it looks like we've got a fascinating journey ahead of us,
Yeah.
tracing the evolution of plants through these excerpts, which focus on the four major plant divisions.
From the simplest to the most complex, huh? Well, I'm ready to explore how plants evolved, those amazing adaptations they've developed to survive, and why this all matters to humans. And hey, maybe we'll even figure out what's for dinner tonight.
Sounds like a plan. So the textbook starts by reminding us that all plants, from towering redwoods to delicate ferns, ultimately evolved from humble algae.
It's mind-boggling to think about, isn't it? Those tiny algae were the pioneers, paving the way for all the plant diversity we see today.
Exactly. The textbook uses a diagram called a cladogram to illustrate how these plant groups are related, like a family tree showing their evolutionary connections. Bryophytes, Pteridophytes, Gymnosperms, and Angiosperms.
Wow, those are some serious botanical terms. But before we get lost in the branches of that family tree, what do all these divisions have in common?
Well, they're all multicellular, meaning they're made up of many cells, and those cells have a nucleus. They also have cell walls made of cellulose, which gives them structure.
And I remember from my biology classes that plants are mostly autotrophic, right? Like those little green factories harnessing sunlight to make their own food.
Exactly. Photosynthesis is their superpower. And they all share this really cool life cycle that alternates between two generations, the sporophyte and the gainophyte. It's like a plant version of a relay race.
Sporophyte, Gymnosperms sounds a bit complicated.
Not really. Think of it like this. The sporophyte produces spores, and those spores grow into the gametophyte, and the gametophyte produces gametes like sperm and egg cells in animals.
Okay, starting to make sense now. So these four divisions, they represent different stages in how plants evolve to solve the challenges of life on land, like figuring out how to transport water and nutrients, how to reproduce, and how to become less dependent on water.
Right. It's like a step-by-step journey from simple to complex.
So let's start with the pioneers, those tiny but mighty bryophytes, mosses, liverworts, and hornworts. You find them clinging to rocks in damp, shady spots, but they never seem to grow very tall. Why is that?
That's because they lack vascular tissue. It's like they're missing the plumbing system that most plants use to transport water and nutrients.
So they're stuck in miniature, like tiny green carpets.
Exactly. But they're resourceful little plants. They can reproduce both sexually and asexually, which gives them an edge in tough environments.
And here's a fun fact. The green, leafy part of a moss that we typically see is actually the gymnophyte generation. In more complex plants, it's the sporophyte generation that dominates. So mosses are kind of playing by a different set of roles.
That's a good observation. Okay, so moving on to our next plant division, we've got the pteridophytes, the ferns.
Ferns! Ah, yes, I love their delicate fronds. They still love those damp environments, but unlike mosses, they can range in size from tiny to tree-sized.
Yeah, ferns have figured out the plumbing problem. They have vascular tissue, which allows for larger growth and more efficient transport of water and nutrients.
So they're like mosses with a plumbing upgrade.
Exactly. They've also evolved fronds, which are their leaves, rhizomes, which are underground stems, and adventitious roots. They're definitely a step up in complexity.
But they still rely on spores for reproduction, just like bryophytes, right?
Right. And they have those interesting structures called sori on the undersides of their fronds. They're clusters of sporangia, which produce and release the spores.
So from tiny mosses to ferns with their impressive fronds, we're seeing an increase in size and complexity. But what's the next big leap in plant evolution?
Well, next, we enter the realm of the gymnosperms.
Gymnosperms, the ones with the naked seeds. It always sounds a bit mysterious. And this group includes some real heavy hitters like cycads, the ancient ginkgo biloba, and that bizarre Welwitschia plant.
And of course, we can't forget the most famous gymnosperms of all the conifers, like pine trees.
Ah, yes, the conifers. Their cones are a familiar sight in many forests. So what's the story behind those naked seeds? Why are they called that?
Well, gymnosperms produce seeds, but those seeds develop in cones and are exposed, not enclosed within a fruit like the seeds of flowering plants.
So no fruity protection for these guys. But they've got some serious survival skills, don't they? Especially in places with harsh conditions.
Right. They've evolved some amazing adaptations. They have well-developed root systems to access water, and those needle-like leaves we see on pines, which are coated with a waxy cuticle to reduce water loss.
So they're like the camels of the plant world, built to conserve water.
Exactly. And they've also mastered the art of wind pollination. Instead of relying on insects or animals to carry their pollen, they produce vast quantities of lightweight pollen that can be carried by the wind.
Makes sense, but it also explains why my allergies go crazy this time of year. But I was surprised to learn that pine trees aren't actually native to South Africa.
That's right. And even though they're not indigenous, their extensive root systems can sometimes outcompete native plants for water. It's a reminder that introducing non-native species can have unintended consequences.
It's fascinating how plants have evolved to conquer the challenges of life on land, from relying on water for reproduction to developing seeds and pollen for a more independent lifestyle. We've seen how they've increased in complexity and size, from the simple bryophytes to the towering pines. It's been quite a journey.
It has. And our journey isn't over yet. We still have the most diverse and successful group to explore, the angiosperms.
The angiosperms, those flowering plants, now we're talking. They dominate our world, our gardens, and even our plates.
Exactly. Angiosperms are the stars of the plant world, with their seeds enclosed within fruits. They've developed some incredible reproductive strategies, and their diversity is simply astounding.
Flowers and fruits, the ultimate power couple. But what else sets angiosperms apart from their less flashy ancestors?
Well, they've got all the bells and whistles. True roots, stems, and leaves, a very efficient vascular system, and either fibrous or taproot systems. But their real claim to fame is their reproductive prowess.
You mean those beautiful flowers?
Exactly. And their flowers are much more than just pretty faces. They're incredibly complex structures designed to attract pollinators and ensure successful reproduction.
They're like tiny, intricate machines.
Exactly. And then, of course, you have the fruits, which not only protect the developing seeds, but also help to disperse them.
It's amazing how much diversity there is among angiosperms. From towering trees to delicate wildflowers, they've really mastered the art of survival and reproduction.
Absolutely. And their success is due in large part to some remarkable adaptations they've evolved. But before we dive into the fascinating world of flowers and fruits, let's take a step back and look at the bigger picture.
Sound good. Let's zoom out for a moment and consider the overall evolutionary trends we've seen. What stands out to you?
I think what's most striking is how plants have become less and less dependent on water for survival and reproduction over millions of years.
It's like watching a slow-motion jailbreak from their watery origins.
I love that analogy. Each plant division we've talked about shows an increasing level of adaptation to life on land, from the Bryophytes, who still need water for fertilization, to the sophisticated mechanisms of the Gymnosperms and Angiosperms, who have found ways to reproduce without relying on water.
So seeds and pollen grains were real game changers in the plant world. They allowed plants to break free from their dependence on water for fertilization and spread to new environments.
Absolutely. It's a great example of how evolution drives innovation and adaptation. And this leads us to another fascinating aspect of plant evolution: the different strategies they've developed for reproduction. So we've seen how plants have evolved to conquer life on land, but their journey doesn't stop there. Let's dig into the fascinating world of plant reproduction. We've talked about sexual and asexual reproduction. Can we break those down a bit? Like, what are the pros and cons of each strategy, and how do those strategies differ across the plant divisions?
Yeah, you're right. Plants have a whole playbook of reproductive strategies. So let's start with asexual reproduction. Seems like the easy option, right? One parent, boom, offspring.
Exactly. Asexual reproduction only needs one parent and those offspring. They're basically genetic clones, identical copies. It's fast and super efficient, especially in stable environments where things aren't changing much.
Like if a plant is trying to quickly colonize a new area where conditions are favorable.
Yeah, exactly. Think of it like hitting copy and paste for a plant. But there's a downside: lack of genetic diversity. It can be a real problem if conditions change, you know? Like, imagine a disease hits or the climate shifts dramatically. If all the plants are genetically identical, they're all equally vulnerable.
So it's like putting all your eggs in one basket, which is never a good idea. But that's where sexual reproduction comes in, right? With two parents mixing their genes.
Right. It's more complex for sure, but that complexity comes with a big payoff: genetic diversity. Offspring inherit a mix of genes from both parents, which makes them more adaptable, more likely to survive in changing conditions.
It's like nature's way of hedging its bets, ensuring that at least some of those offspring will have the traits they need to thrive, even when things get unpredictable.
Exactly. And looking back at the plant divisions, we can see how these different reproductive strategies play out. Bryophytes and Pteridophytes, for example, they can reproduce both sexually and asexually, which makes them pretty flexible.
While Gymnosperms and Angiosperms, they've gone all in on sexual reproduction, maximizing genetic diversity to ensure long-term survival.
Exactly. It's like they're playing the long game of evolution. And speaking of angiosperms, let's talk about their most dazzling feature, those flowers. They're beautiful, no doubt, but there's so much more to them than meets the eye.
Flowers are definitely eye-catching, but I know they're not just there for decoration. What's their real purpose?
Well, flowers are the reproductive powerhouses of angiosperms. First and foremost, they protect the plant's reproductive organs, those delicate parts that make the pollen and the ovules.
So it's like a fortress for baby plants.
A beautiful fortress. Secondly, flowers attract pollinators, insects, birds, even bats. They use a dazzling array of colors, shapes, scents, and nectar to lure these animals in.
It's like a plant's version of a dating app. They're using all the tricks to attract a mate.
That's a great analogy. And finally, flowers facilitate sexual reproduction by bringing the pollen and the ovules together so fertilization can take place.
Okay, you've convinced me. Flowers are amazing, but can we break down the anatomy of a flower a bit? What are the key parts we need to know about?
Sure. Imagine a flower, like a series of concentric circles, each with its own special role to play. The outermost layer is called the calyx, and it's made up of sepals, which are those little green leaf-like structures that protect the developing bud. Then you have the corolla, which is the showiest part of the flower. Those are the petals, often brightly colored to attract pollinators.
And those are usually the parts we notice first.
Right. But inside the corolla are the real stars of the show, the stamens and the pistils. The stamens are the male parts of the flower. Each stamen has a filament, a long stalk, and an anther at the top where pollen is produced.
So the stamen is like the pollen factory.
Exactly. And then you have the pistil, which is the female part of the flower. It has a sticky stigma at the top to receive the pollen, a style, which is a tube that connects the stigma to the ovary, and the ovary itself where the ovules, which develop into seeds, are located.
So it's all about getting the pollen from the anther of one flower to the stigma of another, right? But is it always a love story between two different plants?
Not necessarily. Some plants can actually self-pollinate, where pollen from a flower fertilizes an ovule on the same plant. It's efficient, but limits genetic mixing. Other plants rely on cross-pollination, where pollen from one plant is transferred to a flower on a different plant of the same species, which helps boost genetic diversity.
Cross-pollination sounds like it requires some serious matchmaking.
Indeed. And that's where pollination strategies come in. This is where things get really fascinating. We've got wind pollination, water pollination, insect pollination, bird pollination. It's like a global matchmaking service for plants.
Exactly. It's amazing how plants have evolved such a wide range of strategies to get the job done. So tell me, what are some of the key adaptations we see in plants that rely on different pollination methods?
Well, wind-pollinated plants like grasses and many trees, they produce a ton of lightweight pollen that can travel long distances on the breeze. Their flowers are usually pretty small and not very showy. They don't need to attract insects or birds, so they don't bother with bright colors or strong scents.
Makes sense. No need for fancy decorations if you're letting the wind do the work. But what about the plants that rely on animals for pollination? They seem to go all out in terms of attracting their matchmakers.
Oh, absolutely. Insect-pollinated flowers often have bright colors, sweet scents, and even special landing platforms to entice their pollinators. They also produce nectar, a sugary liquid that insects love.
It's like a reward for their services. And it's not just insects, right? There are plants that rely on birds for pollination, too.
Right, like the iconic Strelitzia regina, the bird of paradise here in South Africa. Those flowers are large and sturdy to accommodate their avian visitors, with vibrant colors, often red or orange, that birds can easily spot.
And their pollen is usually sticky, so it can cling to a bird's feathers as it sips nectar. It's like a perfectly choreographed dance between plants and animals.
It really is.
Yeah.
And if you pay attention to the flowers in your own environment, you can start to unravel these hidden partnerships. Look at the colors, the shapes, the scents, and the visitors they attract, and you'll gain a whole new appreciation for the intricate dance of pollination.
It's like a secret world waiting to be discovered. But pollination is just the first step, right? What happens next in the grand reproductive journey?
Well, after pollination, you have fertilization, and then the development of seeds, those tiny packages of potential. It's like a time capsule carrying the genetic blueprint for a new generation.
Seeds are incredible, but how do they actually form? Can you walk me through the process?
Sure. So once a pollen grain lands on the stigma of a flower, it actually germinates, kind of like a seed sprouting. It grows a pollen tube that extends down through the style all the way to the ovary.
It's like building a tiny tunnel for the pollen to reach the ovule.
Exactly. That pollen tube carries the male gametes, which fertilize the ovule. And once that happens, the fertilized ovule develops into a seed, and the ovary wall thickens to form the fruit.
So a seed is basically a baby plant in a protective package, all set to grow into a mature plant.
Right. And each seed comes equipped with everything it needs to get started. It's got a seed coat or testa for protection, a food supply in the form of cotyledons, and a radicle, which is the embryonic root, and a plumule, which is the embryonic shoot.
It's amazing how much is packed into something so small. And I remember reading that there are two main types of seeds, monocots and dicots.
That's right. Monocots, like grasses and corn, have one cotyledon, while dicots, like beans and most trees, have two. It's one way that botanists classify flowering plants. But why are seeds so important in the grand scheme of things?
Well, they ensure genetic diversity, right? And they can survive some pretty harsh conditions. Plus, they have all sorts of ingenious adaptations for dispersal, getting themselves spread far and wide. It's like they have a built-in survival kit.
Absolutely. And that brings us to another fascinating topic, seed banks.
Seed banks, those vaults for biodiversity, they're like safeguarding the future of plants. But how do they actually work?
Seed banks play a crucial role in plant conservation and research. They collect and store seeds from a huge variety of plants, including rare and endangered species. It's like creating a backup copy of nature's hard drive.
So we don't lose those precious genetic resources. And I remember reading about the Svalbard Global Seed Vault in Norway, buried deep in the permafrost. It sounds like something out of a science fiction movie.
It's pretty incredible.
Yeah.
The seeds are stored at freezing temperatures and dried to prevent decay. But seeds aren't just important for conservation. They play a vital role in our everyday lives, especially on our plates.
You're right. Seeds are a staple food source for humans and countless other creatures. Think of all those essential crops. Coffee, maize, wheat, rice, beans, the list goes on and on.
And let's not forget about their nutritional value. Pulses like beans, lentils, and chickpeas are packed with protein, and grains provide energy-giving carbohydrates.
It's amazing how much we rely on seeds for sustenance. But there's more to seeds than just the common crops we find in the supermarket, right? What about those seeds that are unique to certain regions?
You're talking about endemic seeds. Those are seeds that are naturally found only in specific regions. They often have unique flavors and represent important cultural traditions.
Like sorghum, which is used to make porridge and traditional beer in some parts of Africa.
Or maize, ground into sam, a staple in many African cuisines.
And there's millet, a nutritious and gluten-free grain that's been cultivated in Africa for centuries. It's a reminder that plant biodiversity is not just about preserving species for future generations. It's also about celebrating those unique flavors and traditions that connect us to our heritage. You know, it's amazing to think that something as tiny as a seed can have such a huge impact, not just on the plant itself, but on entire ecosystems and even human cultures.
It really shows how interconnected life on Earth is, doesn't it? We've seen how plants have developed these incredible strategies to survive and reproduce, and how they've formed these really intricate relationships with other organisms like pollinators and seed dispersers.
It's like each plant has its own story to tell, a tale of resilience and adaptation and connection to the environment around it. And these stories aren't just fascinating, they're also really important for understanding the natural world and our place in it.
Yeah, I agree. We tend to take plants for granted, but this deep dive has really shown me how complex and important they are.
Me too. We started with those simple bryophytes clinging to life in damp little corners, and now we're talking about the amazing mechanisms of flowering plants. It's mind-blowing to think that all this diversity came from a common ancestor millions of years ago.
It is, and it's not just about the past either.
Yeah.
Plant biodiversity is crucial for our future. It's the foundation of your food systems. It provides us with medicines and materials, and it plays a vital role in regulating the climate.
Exactly. This isn't just about admiring pretty flowers. It's about understanding that our own well-being is tied to the health and diversity of plants.
Absolutely. Every seed holds so much potential for resilience, adaptation, and even new discoveries. The more we learn about plants, the more we realize how much more there is to learn.
It's like we've only just scratched the surface of this vast and fascinating world.
That's what makes it so exciting. There's always something new to discover. Every backyard, every park, every forest, it's all a living laboratory just waiting to be explored.
So what questions has this deep dive sparked for you? What can you learn from the plants in your own neighborhood?
Take a closer look at the flowers you see. Observe their shapes, their colors, the insects that are attracted to them, and think about how they've adapted to their specific environment. You might be surprised at what you find.
It's a good reminder that the natural world is full of wonder and beauty, often hidden in plain sight. So keep exploring, keep learning, and keep appreciating the incredible world of plants. They're not just silent bystanders, they're active participants in this grand evolutionary story, a story that we're all a part of.